Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're tackling a stack of sources. It's a deep dive report looking into the key stage 2 English curriculum in England. We're focusing particularly on those really crucial years, year 5 and year 6. So that's kids aged about, 9 to 11?
That's right, a pivotal stage.
And our mission really is to pull back the curtain on the often complex world of SpaG. That's spelling, punctuation, and grammar.
Ah, yes, SpaG, familiar to many teachers and parents.
Exactly. We're going to unpack what the national curriculum actually requires pupils to learn here, the kinds of tricky linguistic skills they're expected to get their heads around, and maybe most critically, what the research actually tells us about the best ways to teach these skills, especially, with the shadow of high-stakes testing hanging over year 6.
Yeah, that's a key point. You've given us a really rich set of materials, curriculum documents, academic analysis, lots of pedagogical research. We're going to try and navigate through all of that to give you, the listener, a clearer picture. We'll look at what the curriculum intends, the specific knowledge pupils are meant to acquire, the structure, and, importantly, the impact of that statutory test. And we'll dig into the evidence-based strategies for actually teaching this stuff effectively.
Sounds good. Get ready for, hopefully, some surprising facts, maybe an aha moment or two, and, fingers crossed, a much clearer understanding of what's really going on in primary classrooms trying to juggle, ambitious learning with these assessment demands.
This should be interesting.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating area because it touches on something so fundamental, literacy, but it also involves a lot of debate, doesn't it, about how best to teach it. So let's unpack this. We start in year 5. The sources, they really emphasize that the curriculum isn't just like a shopping list of skills. It's designed as a holistic and integrated model for literacy.
That phrase comes up a lot, holistic and integrated.
Yeah, it sounds more like an ecosystem, than separate subjects and boxes.
Precisely. The intention, the philosophy behind it is that the different parts of literacy, spoken language, reading, writing, and yes, SpaG aren't meant to be taught in isolation. They're supposed to be deeply interconnected. Each one supports and builds upon the others.
Like threads in a rope.
That's a good analogy, threads in a single strong rope rather than lots of individual weaker strands. The curriculum, ideally, envisages this seamless flow between all these elements.
Well, the sources seem to highlight spoken language as being, foundational, almost the absolute base layer. It's not just about chatting, is it? It's about using talk to think.
Exactly. It's really positioned as the bedrock. In year 5, the curriculum expects pupils to significantly develop their skills in talking, listening, and using language, not just, for chatting in the playground, but as a tool for clarifying their thoughts before they even pick up a pen.
Okay, so thinking out loud almost.
Sort of, yes. It means actively participating in discussions, getting confident, articulating and justifying their own opinions, learning how to argue a point effectively, even hypothesizing out loud, exploring ideas through spoken language. And by engaging in that kind of rich oral communication, they are often implicitly developing more complex sentence structures, they're expanding their vocabulary, and they're gaining a confidence with language that then becomes crucial when they need to write. It's about building that confidence through the spoken word first.
Okay, so using language actively through speaking feeds into everything else. That makes sense. And alongside that, there's reading. The curriculum specifies reading a really wide range of text, fiction, nonfiction, poetry, myths, historical stuff, you name it.
A real breadth is expected.
And this isn't just about reading for the joy of a story, although that's vital, obviously, or even just for understanding the plot or getting information. There's more to it.
Oh, much more. The sources are quite clear. Reading is seen as a primary, maybe the primary, way for pupils to implicitly acquire grammar and vocabulary. Just by immersing themselves in good quality texts written by skilled authors, pupils are constantly exposed to sophisticated sentences, varied and precise vocabulary, effective punctuation, all used in authentic contexts.
So they're learning by osmosis almost.
To an extent, yes, but they're also expected to move beyond simple comprehension. They need to analyze how authors use language. That includes things like figurative language, sentence length variations, specific grammatical structures, and they need to think about the impact these choices have on the reader.
Like an apprenticeship, you said, seeing how the masters do it.
Exactly like an apprenticeship. They see how the masters use their tools, the grammatical structures, the vocabulary before they try using them themselves. Reading provides these rich, living examples of grammar and vocabulary in action.
That connection feels really powerful. Reading shows them what's possible, and then logically they move to writing, which the sources break down into composition, the ideas and structure, and handwriting.
Yes, and Year 5 expects pupils to engage with that whole writing process in a more sophisticated way than they might have before. It starts with planning. That means thinking carefully about their audience and purpose. Who am I writing for? Why am I writing this? And critically, using their reading as models.
Ah, linking back to the reading again.
Always linking back,
Yeah.
drawing inspiration from the structures, the language, the techniques they've seen authors use. Then comes the drafting stage, where they focus on selecting the right grammar and vocabulary for the effect they want. This includes things like describing settings and characters vividly, integrating dialogue so it sounds natural, not clunky. And finally, they get to the evaluation and editing stage, revisiting their work, trying to improve vocabulary choices, making sentences better, ensuring the tense is consistent, and of course, proofreading carefully for spelling and punctuation errors. It's meant to be a cycle. Plan, draft, evaluate, edit.
And the handwriting bit, the sources mention it needs to be fluent. Why is that emphasized so much? It feels a bit basic compared to composition.
It might seem basic, but the fluency of handwriting, or what's often called transcription, just the physical act of getting words down, is surprisingly important for the quality of the composition itself.
How so?
Well, think about it. If a pupil is still really struggling with forming letters correctly or joining them up smoothly or just writing quickly enough to keep pace with their ideas, that takes up a huge amount of their cognitive load. Their working memories is essentially clogged up with the mechanics of writing.
Ah, see. No brain space left for the creative stuff.
Exactly. There's less mental capacity left for the higher level demands of composition. Generating ideas, structuring paragraphs, choosing precise words, thinking about using grammar for effect. So developing fluent, legible, reasonably fast handwriting actually frees up the brain to focus entirely on the creative and linguistic aspects of writing. It's about removing a barrier to expressing their ideas.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So the ideal picture painted by the curriculum is this really integrated system. Spoken language builds the foundation, reading provides the models and the implicit learning, and writing is where it all comes together, where skills are applied and practiced. But D and the forces are very direct about this. This is where it gets really interesting and potentially quite problematic. There's a fundamental tension right at the heart of this system.
Absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head. The intention is all about integration and function, using grammar to communicate effectively. But the introduction of the statutory SpaG test at the end of Key Stage 2, the SATs, creates what the report calls a powerful backwash effect.
Backwash effect sounds ominous.
Well, it is significant. This test is a high-stakes accountability measure for schools. And the test itself often features questions that require pupils to, say, identify grammatical terms, correct isolated sentences, or manipulate language features completely out of context. It becomes about demonstrating knowledge of the labels and the rules in a very decontextualized format.
So the test format rewards something quite different from the curriculum's goal of using grammar as a tool within writing.
Precisely. And because the test is statutory and the results matter for school league tables and judgments, schools are under immense pressure to make sure their pupils do well on it.
Understandably.
The logical response, although, as the research suggests, problematic, is to teach to the test. And what that means in practice is dedicating valuable classroom time to drills, worksheets, practice papers, exercises that focus specifically on identifying and labeling grammatical features in isolation, practicing the exact type of questions found on the test.
Right. Practice makes perfect for the test anyway.
Maybe for the test. But here's the fundamental tension. This isolated, decontextualized grammar teaching, as the source report emphasizes by citing extensive research, is not supported by evidence as an effective way to improve children's overall writing quality.
Wow, okay, so the very thing designed to improve writing standards might be pushing teaching methods that research says don't actually achieve that goal, and maybe even take time away from things that do work. That feels like a real paradox.
It is. It's exactly the assessment paradox that the sources talk about. The challenge for a Year 5 teacher, and then maybe even more intensely for a Year 6 teacher, is navigating this dichotomy. How do you foster the rich, integrated literacy skills the curriculum envisions, the love of reading, the fluency in writing, the confidence in communication, while also ensuring pupils can meet the very specific, often quite separate, demands of the test? It requires a very difficult balancing act.
Yeah, a difficult balancing act with real consequences for what actually happens day to day in the classroom. Let's dive deeper then into the specifics. What are pupils actually expected to learn in Year 5? What are the concrete spelling, grammar, and punctuation goals for these 9 and 10-year-olds?
Okay, year 5 really marks quite a significant cognitive shift, especially in how pupils approach spelling. It moves beyond just, sounding out words or applying basic phonics rules. It starts getting into understanding the structure of words, that's morphology, and their historical origins, which is etymology.
Right.
And this shift is really about equipping them to handle the longer, more complex vocabulary they start encountering as their reading gets more advanced.
So they're becoming little linguistic detectives, not just sounders out.
That's a great way to put it, exactly. They learn about statutory patterns where the spelling doesn't match the modern pronunciations simply because of the word's history. Think about words with silent letters.
Oh, like night.
Precisely. The curriculum explicitly lists statutory words like night, solemn, yacht. These spellings are often relics of older forms of English or words borrowed from other languages. Etymology, understanding the word's history, helps explain why those letters are there, even if we don't hear them anymore.
Silent letters are such a headache sometimes.
They really can be, unless you have that underlying logic. Another big focus in year 5 is suffixes, particularly those tricky ones that create an ashuz or shul sound at the end of a word.
Ah, yes, like fallacious or ballacious.
Exactly. They need to learn when to use alacious versus slowish for the shu sound, and alacial versus lacial for the shul sound. And the guidance often links us back to the root word. For example, words ending in so, like grace, often take salacious to become gracious. Words ending in scarcial, like ambition, often take salacious to become ambitious.
Okay.
And for the shul sound, words ending in sil or s, like office, often take salocial official, while others might take salocial, like essential from essence.
And the sources list specific statutory examples here. Conscious, ambitious, official, essential. So these aren't just general rules they need to know. They have to know these specific words too.
Correct. There's a defined list they're expected to master over years 5 and 6. They also continue to work hard on homophones and words that are frequently confused.
Like affect and effect.
That's a classic year 56 pair.
Ah.
Affect, usually the verb meaning to influence, versus effect, usually the noun meaning the result. Or principal, head of a school, or meaning main, versus principle, a rule or belief, or even stationary, meaning not moving, versus stationary writing paper and pens. Understanding the meaning is absolutely crucial here, not just relying on the sound.
And using that morphology and etymology helps unlock those meanings too, presumably.
Absolutely. Breaking words down into their parts, the root word, any prefixes like dis, de, miss, and suffixes like ate, eyes. Suffix is a really powerful strategy. It helps pupils understand both the spelling and the meaning of new, unfamiliar words. The sources give a brilliant example. Getting pupils to recognize that conscious and science actually share the same Latin root, scio, which means to know.
Oh, that's fascinating. I never knew that.
Right. And knowing that connection not only helps you remember the psi spelling in both words, but it also links their meanings together conceptually. It's like getting a mini history and meaning lesson embedded right there in the word itself, makes it less arbitrary.
Definitely. It gives them a framework.
It does. They also learn how adding certain suffixes actually changes the word class. For instance, adding eight, by often turns a noun or adjective into a verb. Like communicate, that's a statutory word, or standardize, beautify. Understanding this helps them expand their vocabulary functionally when they come to write.
And to really apply all these strategies effectively, they need good dictionary and thesaurus skills.
Essential tools of the trade by this stage. A dictionary isn't just for checking if a spelling is right or wrong. In year 5 and 6, they're explicitly taught to use it to find the full meaning, to understand different ways a word can be used, and even to discover its origin, the etymology we talked about.
And the thesaurus.
Vital for developing vocabulary choice in writing. Finding synonyms to avoid repeating the same word over and over, or finding a more precise or powerful word, and finding antonyms helps them explore contrasts and opposites.
And underpinning all this spelling work is the infamous Year 56 statutory word list. These are words pupils are just expected to know how to spell by the end of year 6. The list is pretty long, isn't it? And some are notoriously tricky.
They are indeed. It's a substantial list. Some examples that year 5 pupils start working on and are expected to master include words like accompany, ancient, awkward, bargain, bruise, category, cemetery, that's a common, tricky one, committee, community, competition.
Wow, some of those are tough.
And it continues into year 6 with words like conscience, controversy, convenience, correspond, criticize with the S, Curiosity, definite, desperate, determined, develop, dictionary, disastrous, embarrassed, double R, double R's, environment, equip, especially, exaggerate, excellent, existence, explanation, familial, foreign, frequently, government, harass, hindrance, identity, immediately, individual, interfere, interrupt. It's a challenging and pretty diverse list covering both common, tricky words and more sophisticated vocabulary. The expectation is consistent, accurate spelling of all these words in their writing.
That is a substantial spelling mountain to climb.
Yeah.
Okay, so that gives us a good snapshot of spelling in year 5. What about grammar and punctuation specifically? How does that develop?
Well, in year 5, the curriculum really shifts the focus of grammar. It moves away from just, say, identifying parts of speech toward understanding grammar as a system of choices that are available to the writer.
Ah, so less what is a noun and more why would I choose this noun here? What effect does it have?
Precisely. It's about understanding how choosing one word or one structure over another impacts the meaning, the tone, or the overall effect of their writing. A key concept introduced here is modal verbs.
Okay, words like might, should, must.
Exactly. Might, should, will, must, could, and also related adverbs like perhaps, surely, definitely. Crucially, the teaching focuses on how these words express different degrees of possibility, probability, certainty, or obligation.
So the nuances.
Yes, the nuances. The teaching moves towards exploring the function, how choosing could suggests possibility, whereas should suggests a recommendation and must indicate strong obligation or certainty. It's about the subtle power these little words wield in shaping meaning and tone.
That feels like a significant step up from just identifying them in a list. It's understanding their strategic use.
It really is. Another pivotal concept introduced properly in year 5 is relative clauses. This is a key way pupils learn to combine sentences and add detail more efficiently.
Using who, which.
Yes, they learn to introduce these clauses using relative pronouns like who for people, which for things, where for places, when for times, whose for possession, and that, which can often replace who or which. The sources give a simple, clear example. You take two sentences like, the boy was my friend, and the boy wore a blue coat. You can combine them into one, more sophisticated sentence, the boy who wore a blue coat was my friend.
Much smoother.
And they also learn that sometimes you can actually omit the relative pronoun for conciseness, especially that or who, when they're not the subject of the clause, like in the film I watched last night was great. This is fundamental to building more complex and fluent sentences, moving beyond those simple subject-verb-object structures.
Right, it lets them layer information more effectively within a single sentence. And you mentioned derivational morphology again earlier with spelling, but you said it comes into grammar too.
Yes, it bridges the two. It links back to the spelling work, but with a specific grammatical focus. Adding suffixes like suppa, psych, saphacy, or prefixes like dis, d, miss, doesn't just affect the spelling and meaning, it often changes the word's class or grammatical function.
Okay, how it works in a sentence.
Exactly. Understanding that adding ion to the verb decide gives you the noun decision, and that the noun decision functions differently in a sentence than the verb decide, expands their options for sentence structure and vocabulary choice when they write. For example, they could compare they decided to leave with they made the decision to leave. Both convey similar information, but the grammatical structure is different, offering flexibility.
Okay, so connecting the word building directly to the sentence building. What about punctuation in year 5? Does that get more complex too?
Yes, parenthesis is introduced. That's the technique of inserting extra information, maybe a comment or an afterthought, into a sentence using pairs of commas, pairs of brackets, or pairs of dashes.
Like adding a little aside.
Exactly. The example given is Mount Everest, the highest mountain in the world, is part of the Himalayas. This lets writers slot in non-essential but interesting details without interrupting the main flow of the sentence. It adds texture and variety.
And commas themselves, they go beyond just separating items in a list.
Significantly beyond. In year 5, they start learning to use commas to clarify meaning and prevent ambiguity. This is actually a surprisingly high-level skill because it requires pupils to think like a reader. They have to anticipate where their audience might get confused if a comma isn't there.
Ah, the classic let's eat grandma example.
That's the one. The sources use it too. It perfectly illustrates the absolutely crucial difference a comma makes between let's eat grandma, inviting grandma to join the meal, and let's eat grandma, which is, well, rather gruesome.
It certainly drives the point home. Comma placement is vital.
Absolutely vital for meaning sometimes. Finally, in year 5, they work explicitly on developing cohesion. That's like the glue that makes a piece of text hang together smoothly and logically, making it easy for the reader to follow.
How do they do that?
It happens at different levels. Within a paragraph, they learn to use pronouns effectively to avoid awkward repetition. Example, Sarah went to the park. She played on the swings. Instead of Sarah went to the park, Sarah played on the swings. They also use adverbials like then, after that, firstly to signal the sequence of events or ideas.
Okay.
And it also applies across paragraphs, linking ideas between paragraphs using connecting adverbials of time, later, meanwhile, place, nearby, further away, or number, secondly, finally. And importantly, maintaining a consistent tense throughout a narrative unless there's a very deliberate reason to shift, like for a flashback.
So year 5 is really about building these foundational structures, starting to see grammar as functional choices, and connecting the dots between word structure, sentence structure, and how the whole text flows together. It's quite a complex set of interconnected skills they're developing.
It really is.
But as we discussed, that shadow of the year 6 SpaG test is always there, potentially pulling teaching back towards that more isolated focus we talked about earlier.
That tension is ever present, yes.
Right. Which leads us neatly into year 6. What's fascinating here is the progression, how year 6 builds on all these year 5 concepts and introduces even more abstract ideas, all while presumably preparing for that statutory assessment.
Yeah, year 6 is definitely about consolidating everything learned in year 5 and then pushing into greater complexity and abstraction. The expectation now is that pupils not only understand these concepts, but can use them consciously, deliberately, for specific effects in their own writing. The idea of grammar being a system of choices becomes even more critical.
So using a relative clause isn't just about getting it technically correct. It's a deliberate choice to add detail concisely, perhaps, or to vary sentence structure.
Exactly that. And they move into some quite advanced grammatical concepts. One big one is the explicit distinction between formal and informal language, especially thinking about how this applies to writing for different purposes and audiences.
Is this just about avoiding slang? Or is it deeper?
Oh, much deeper than just avoiding slang. It involves conscious vocabulary choices, knowing when it's more appropriate to use a formal verb like discover instead of the phrasal verb find out, or request instead of ask for, or enter instead of go in.
Okay.
But it also includes understanding how grammatical structures differ. Informal language often uses contractions, don't, can't. More phrasal verbs, look up information, maybe question tags, isn't it? Formal writing, on the other hand, typically favors the full forms, do not, cannot, single word verbs, research information, and avoids things like question tags. They might even touch on more complex formal structures like the subjunctive mood, which I know we'll get to.
Ah, yes, the subjunctive. Sounds slightly terrifying. But before we tackle that, there's the active and passive voice. This seems like a really big concept taught in year 6.
It is a significant grammatical concept, yes. Pupils learn that the voice of a verb indicates whether the grammatical subject of the sentence is performing the action, that's the active voice, or receiving the action, that's the passive voice.
Okay, can you give an example?
Sure. In the active voice, the typical structure is subject, verb, object. Tom accidentally dropped the glass. Here, Tom is the subject, he's performing the action dropped, and the glass is the object receiving the action. This voice is usually more direct, more energetic, and it's very common in narrative writing.
Clear and easy to follow.
Right. Now, the passive voice rearranges this. The object of the active sentence, the glass, becomes the subject of the passive sentence. And the original subject, Tom, is either left out completely or put into a phrase starting with by. So the passive version would be, the glass was accidentally dropped by Tom. Now, the glass is the subject, but it's receiving the action of being dropped.
Okay, I see the shift. Why would you use the passive?
Good question. It has specific uses. It's often used in formal, scientific, or technical writing where the action itself is more important than who performed it. Think the experiment was conducted rather than we conducted the experiment. It sounds more objective. Right. It's also used when the person or thing doing the action, the agent, is unknown or just unimportant. Or, as the sources rather pointedly note, sometimes it's used deliberately to obscure responsibility. The classic example being mistakes were made, which avoids saying who made the mistakes.
Yes, that last one is very common in certain circles. The sources mention a fun way teachers sometimes explain this, the by zombies test. How does that work? Sounds memorable.
It is memorable. It's just a quick, informal trick to help pupils identify the passive voice. The idea is if you can plausibly add the phrase by zombies to the end of the main clause and it still makes grammatical sense, then the sentence is probably in the passive voice.
Let's try it. The glass was accidentally dropped.
By zombies. Yeah, that works grammatically. So the glass was accidentally dropped is passive.
Okay, and the active version. Tom accidentally dropped the glass.
By zombies. Doesn't make sense. Tom isn't being dropped by zombies, so Tom accidentally dropped the glass is active. It just helps them quickly check the underlying structure.
That's definitely going to stick in the memory. Okay, now, the moment we've been building up to, the subjunctive mood. I have to confess, even as an adult, this one feels murky.
You are absolutely right. It is probably the most abstract and frankly challenging grammatical concept introduced at this level, and it does cause a lot of confusion, even among proficient English speakers. The subjunctive mood isn't really a tense. It's a mood used to express situations that are hypothetical, wished for, possible, or formally commanded or demanded. In year 6, they typically focus on two main forms.
Okay, let's break it down. Form 1.
The first is the use of were instead of was, regardless of the subject, I, he, she, it, usually after words like if or wish to indicate that a situation is unreal or hypothetical, contrary to fact. The classic example is, if I were you, I wouldn't do that. The were signals, I am not actually you, or I wish it were sunny today implies it is not actually sunny.
Okay, the if I were you example is familiar, but it's good to understand why it's were and not was. That's the subjunctive doing its job.
Exactly. It's the subjunctive signaling that unreal condition. The second main form they encounter is used in quite formal contexts, typically after verbs that express a command, a request, a recommendation, or a demand, words like demand, require, insist, suggest, recommend. In this case, you use the base form of the verb, that's the infinitive, without to, regardless of the subject.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. So you might say, I demand that he be present, not that he is present. Or the rules require that all pupils wear a uniform, not wears a uniform. It sounds very formal, quite official, and it's much less common in everyday spoken English, but important for understanding and potentially using highly formal written language.
Right, that be and that he be present definitely feels very formal, almost archaic sometimes. And punctuation also ramps up in year 6, moving beyond commas for lists and basic parentheses.
Yes, year 6 introduces punctuation marks that help organize and structure sentences in more sophisticated ways, showing more complex relationships between ideas. They learn the semicolon.
Ah, the semicolon, often misused.
Indeed. Its main job is to join two closely related independent clauses that could stand alone as complete sentences but are linked conceptually. For example, it's raining heavily, I'm absolutely fed up. Or, the committee met on Tuesday, the final decision was made unanimously. It suggests a closer link than a full stop, but requires more separation than a comma. It's definitely a step up from avoiding comma splices.
Right, connecting two complete but related thoughts. What about the colon?
The colon is generally used to introduce something that follows logically from or explains the preceding clause. Most commonly, it introduces a list, a quotation, or an explanation or elaboration. For example, she had 3 main goals: to graduate with honors, to find a fulfilling job, and to travel the world. Or, the report concluded with one clear statement: funding for the project was insufficient.
Okay, introducing what comes next. The dash.
The dash, the longer one, not the hyphen, is a bit more versatile. It can sometimes be used informally as an alternative to a semicolon or colon, or it can be used in pairs, like commas or brackets for parenthesis, often adding a slightly more dramatic or informal feel than brackets.
And the hyphen, the shorter one.
The hyphen has several jobs. In year 6, they focus on its use in forming compound adjectives that come before a noun and act as a single descriptive unit, like a state-of-the-art computer or a well-known author. But perhaps more significantly, they learn how crucial it is for preventing ambiguity.
Ah, like the man-eating shark example.
That's the classic one the sources use. It perfectly illustrates the vital difference between a man-eating shark, a shark that habitually eats people terrifying, and a man-eating shark, just a man enjoying a meal of shark meat. That little hyphen entirely changes the meaning and conjures up a very different image.
That example makes it instantly clear why hyphens matter in compound adjectives. And year 6 spelling, does it just continue with the challenging statutory list?
Yes. The focus on mastering the words from the year 56 statutory list intensifies. By the end of year 6, they're expected to consistently spell words like accommodate, double C, double M, mischievous, watch out for that I, parliament, cue, rhythm, 12th.
Some real toughies in there.
Absolutely. They also tackle more complex spelling patterns, including learning to distinguish between suffixes that sound similar but are spelled differently, like ant versus ent, observant versus hesitant, or ants versus ints, existence versus convenience. And the tricky pair, able, dependable versus possible. These often depend on the word's Latin or French origins, linking back to that etymology work.
Right.
Their corresponding adverb forms, ably and ebably, are also covered. Plus, they encounter more complex homophones and learn about hyphenated prefixes in words like cooperate or re-enter to avoid doubled vowels creating misreadings.
So Year 6 really does build substantially on Year 5, introducing more abstract grammar, more nuanced punctuation, and even trickier spelling patterns, which of course brings us squarely to the assessment that concludes Key Stage 2. This raises that important question again. How is all this knowledge and skill assessed, and what impact does that assessment have?
Well, that leads us directly to the statutory Key Stage 2 SpaG test, which all pupils in state schools in England take at the end of Year 6, usually in May. The initial intention behind introducing it, as the sources note, was twofold, primarily to ensure pupils leaving primary school had a solid grasp of essential grammar, punctuation, and spelling skills deemed necessary for secondary school and beyond, and also, hopefully, to drive an improvement in overall writing standards nationally.
Okay, that was the aim. And what does the test actually involve for the pupils sitting it?
It's split into two separate papers, with a total testing time of around 60 minutes, give or take. Paper 1 is usually called the questions paper. This one lasts about 45 minutes and is worth 50 marks. This is where pupils encounter questions covering grammar, punctuation, and also some vocabulary.
What kind of questions?
The format varies, but it often involves things like identifying specific grammatical features within isolated sentences. They might be asked to underline the relative clause or circle the modal verb. They might have to choose the correct punctuation mark for a given phrase, correct sentences containing errors, match grammatical terms to their definitions, or answer multiple choice questions about word classes or sentence functions.
So very focused, quite technical, decontextualized questions on specific points of grammar or punctuation.
Exactly. Highly decontextualized is a key feature. Then there's paper 2, which is the spelling paper. This is much shorter, typically around 15 minutes, and it's worth 20 marks. An administrator reads out 20 words, one by one. Each word is read first on its own, then within a sentence to provide context for meaning, and then repeated on its own. Pupils just have to write down the words correctly.
And those words are drawn from?
They're drawn from, or are representative of, the spelling patterns and rules taught across Key Stage 2, with a strong emphasis on the Year 56 statutory list and other commonly misspelled or complex words appropriate for that age group.
Okay. And in terms of the marks across those two papers, how is the content weighted? What's most important?
Grammar typically carries the largest weight. Depending on the specific test year, it can make up anywhere from 36% to 50% of the total marks available across both papers. Punctuation is the next biggest chunk, usually between 14% and 29%. Spelling, tested solely in paper 2, accounts for about 29%, and vocabulary, tested within paper 1, is actually the smallest component, often only around 4% to 10% of the marks.
So grammar knowledge is heavily weighted.
Very heavily weighted. The specific content tested in that paper 1 reflects what we've discussed for years 5 and 6. Identifying and using different word classes correctly, understanding sentence functions, statement, question, command, exclamation, applying punctuation rules accurately, things like commas, apostrophes for possession and contraction, inverted commas for direct speech, semicolons, colons, and recognizing and sometimes manipulating grammatical structures like the passive voice, modal verbs, relative clauses, and subjunctive forms.
Okay, so that gives us the nuts and bolts of the test itself. But here's where it gets really interesting again, and it links right back to that fundamental tension we identified earlier. The sources highlight a significant and widely discussed disconnect between the research evidence on effective teaching and the policy driving this test.
Yes, this is perhaps the most critical point raised in the source material we looked at. The test, as we said, was introduced with a clear policy goal: improve national writing standards. AUT, and this is the crucial but. The format of the test, its heavy reliance on decontextualized questions, identifying terminology, correcting isolated errors, creates this powerful incentive for schools to prioritize teaching to the test.
Which, as you said, is a logical response to accountability.
It's a completely logical, rational response for schools operating under significant accountability pressure. If your school's performance is partly judged on these test scores, you're going to focus teaching time on drilling the specific skills and question types that will maximize those scores.
But this conflicts with the curriculum's integrated approach.
Absolutely. And more importantly, it runs directly counter to what decades of rigorous educational research, including large-scale randomized controlled trials, systematic reviews, meta-analyses, tell us about effective grammar instruction for improving writing.
Okay, what does the research say?
The overwhelming consensus from this extensive body of evidence is that traditional decontextualized grammar, teaching the kind that focuses on identifying parts of speech, learning rules in isolation, doing drills and exercises like correcting faulty sentences outside the context of meaningful writing. This kind of teaching has little to no positive effect on the actual quality of children's narrative writing.
Little to no positive effect. That's a really stark finding, especially considering the amount of time that might be spent on test preparation because of the high stakes involved.
It is stark. Some studies referenced in the sources even indicate a potential small negative effect.
Negative.
Well, the theory is that when the focus of teaching, driven by the assessment, leans too heavily on just error avoidance and getting discrete grammar points right in isolation, pupils can become overly cautious in their writing. They might start writing simpler, less ambitious sentences. They might avoid using complex structures like relative clauses or varied punctuation like semicolons for fear of making a mistake that they know could be penalized on a test. It can inadvertently stifle their creativity and fluency.
So the test designed to encourage better writing might actually lead to teaching practices that make writing less fluent or creative, or just have no impact on its quality anyway. That is the assessment paradox and that negative backwash effect in action, isn't it?
Precisely. The time and energy dedicated to drilling isolated SpaG points specifically for the test is time and energy that could arguably be better spent on other activities that do have evidence supporting their positive impact on writing, things like sustained, authentic writing composition, drafting and revising for meaning and impact, engaging in deep reading of challenging texts, and developing vocabulary naturally through context and discussion.
And there's also critique from linguistic experts about the actual content of the test itself, beyond just the format.
Yes, the sources mention that too. Some terminology used in the test materials or mark schemes has been described as fuzzy or disputed by professional linguists. These might be terms or definitions that aren't consistently used or precisely defined within linguistic science itself. For example, using the semantic term command to refer to the grammatical category of the imperative mood can be seen as potentially confusing category boundaries. The test also includes questions that are arguably not purely grammar, but fall more under vocabulary or semantics, like identifying synonyms or antonyms. Some experts critique this, arguing it broadens the scope of a grammar test inappropriately, testing related but distinct skills under a single umbrella.
Right, muddying the waters a bit.
And critically, the test format can inadvertently promote the teaching of what some call arbitrary rules or oversimplifications of grammar. A common example cited is the idea that you must always put a comma after a fronted adverbial phrase like, later that day, I went home. While using a comma there is often a good stylistic choice for clarity, it is not a universal, unbreakable grammatical convention of standard English in absolutely all contexts. Presenting it as an absolute, always required rule gives pupils an overly simplistic, sometimes inaccurate view of how English grammar actually works in practice and restricts their understanding of legitimate stylistic variation. While some research, it should be noted, does suggest that discrete skills practice might potentially help with sentence generation in specific ways, the crucial link, or lack thereof, to overall narrative writing quality remains the key point of disconnect highlighted again and again in the sources regarding the current SpaG test.
That really lays bare the challenge for teachers, doesn't it? They are caught between the pressure to achieve good test results, often using methods the test encourages, and the research evidence suggesting those methods don't actually improve the fundamental skill writing quality that the test was originally meant to foster.
That is the central dilemma, the core tension that the source material articulates very clearly.
Given all this complexity and pressure, what are the common difficulties pupils actually face when they're grappling with these SpaG concepts in years 5 and 6, especially under the shadow of that test?
Well, teachers consistently report several persistent tricky areas. Subject-verb agreement is a big one, particularly when sentences become more complex, or when you have collective nouns or distracting phrases sitting between the grammatical subject and the verb. Pupils might write something like, The box of toys are heavy instead of the box of toys is heavy because their brain mistakenly makes the verb agree with the closer plural noun toys rather than the actual singular subject box.
Ah, yes, proximity agreement. Tense consistency must be hard too, especially keeping track in longer narratives.
Absolutely. Maintaining a consistent tense throughout a piece of writing, or knowing how and when to manage deliberate shifts in tense for effect, like using past perfect for a flashback, is a common challenge. Punctuating complex sentences correctly is another frequent source of error. Comma splices, just joining two independent clauses with only a comma, are very common, as are run-on sentences where two clauses are fused together with no punctuation at all, and using those more advanced Year 6 punctuation marks, like semicolons and colons, accurately and appropriately is also challenging for many pupils.
And homophones, of course. They never go away, do they?
Never. Your its, these Ds, remain persistent hurdles that require constant vigilance and careful attention to meaning, not just sound. Punctuating direct speech correctly is another area that's deceptively complex. Getting the inverted commas, speech marks in the right place, knowing whether commas, full stops, question marks go inside or outside the closing quote, depending on the sentence structure. It's fiddly and a common source of errors.
And apostrophes.
Apostrophes continue to be a challenge, particularly distinguishing correctly between singular possession, the girl's book, and regular plural possession, the girl's books, and also knowing when an apostrophe isn't needed at all, like for simple plural nouns, cats, dogs, or possessive pronouns like its or whose. Finally, another common issue impacting clarity is vague pronoun reference, where it's unclear what a pronoun like it, they, or this is actually referring back to in the previous sentence or context.
So quite a range of tricky areas, from basic agreement issues right up to complex punctuation and sentence structure. The sources also mention some pedagogical misconceptions, those fuzzy rules that teachers might sometimes teach, perhaps unintentionally, that aren't entirely accurate.
Yes, sometimes in an effort to simplify things, rules get taught that aren't fully correct and can actually lead to confusion or errors later on, including potentially on the test itself. A classic example mentioned is telling pupils, all adverbs end in "ly."
Which isn't true.
Not at all. While many adverbs of manner do, quickly, happily, many common adverbs of time, soon, then, tomorrow, place, here, there, upstairs, or frequency, often, always, never, absolutely do not end in "ly. And conversely, some words that do end in "ly are actually adjectives like friendly, lovely, lonely. So teaching that rule can lead pupils to misidentify word classes quite badly.
Right, thinking friendly must be an adverb because it ends in ly.
Exactly. Another misconception mentioned is the idea that a sentence written in the past tense must only use past tense verbs. This is incorrect. A sentence whose main verb clearly places it in the past can certainly contain other verb forms, particularly infinitives after auxiliary verbs like did or modal verbs like could. For instance, she did not want to go. Did is past, but want is the base form, the infinitive without to. Or the idea that to is always followed by an infinitive verb. Again, not true when to is functioning as a preposition, which can be followed by a noun or a gerund, the in arrow form used as a noun. Think of phrases like, I look forward to seeing you, or he went to the shop. Seeing and shop are not infinitives. And even the commonly taught fewer versus less distinction, fewer for countable nouns, fewer cars, less for uncountable nouns, less sugar, isn't absolute. It has well-established exceptions, particularly with measures of time, money, and distance, where a less is standard even with plural countables. For example, it took less than 2 hours, it cost less than 5 pounds, the station is less than 3 miles away. So presenting the basic rule as universally applicable isn't entirely accurate.
So it highlights that teachers need not only to have really secure subject knowledge themselves, but also to be careful about teaching oversimplified rules that might actually mislead pupils in the long run. Given all these challenges, and especially the research critique of isolated teaching methods, what does effective pedagogy actually look like for SpaG in years 5 and 6, according to the sources?
Well, the sources are very clear, drawing heavily on that body of research evidence. Effective teaching for Year 5 and 6 grammar, given its nature as a functional system of choices for the writer, has to move significantly beyond just doing isolated drills and filling in worksheets. The most effective pedagogy is described as being contextualized, interactive, and actively promoting metacognition. That is, pupils thinking consciously about their own thinking processes and choices as raters.
Contextualized instruction seems absolutely fundamental, then embedding grammar teaching within actual reading and writing units.
It really is presented as the cornerstone. Grammar shouldn't be treated as a completely separate subject timetabled for, say, 20 minutes on a Tuesday morning. Instead, it should be taught through focused mini lessons that arise naturally from and are directly relevant to the broader reading and writing units the class is working on.
And using real texts.
Absolutely. The primary vehicle for this should be high-quality texts, using authentic examples from children's literature, nonfiction books, poems, etc., to show pupils how grammar actually works in the hands of skilled writers to achieve specific effects. The recommended teaching cycle described in the sources is really powerful. First, pupils read and engage with a high-quality text. Then, together with the teacher, they analyze the author's specific linguistic choices. How did the author use modal verbs here to create uncertainty? Why did they choose to use this relative clause instead of two separate sentences? What's the effect? Next, pupils apply those techniques and choices in their own writing, trying them out for themselves. And finally, they reflect on the effect their own choices have had on their reader. Read, analyze, apply, reflect.
Using mentor text published examples makes so much sense. It shows grammar and its natural habitat doing real work.
Exactly. Instead of just defining modal verb, you'd look at a persuasive text, maybe an advert or a campaign leaflet, and analyze how the author uses words like must, should, or might to create different levels of conviction or suggest possibility. If you're teaching relative clauses, you'd look closely at a rich piece of descriptive writing and see how the author uses them to add detail, concisely and elegantly.
And the teacher's role.
The process typically involves the teacher modeling this kind of analysis and application first, perhaps through shared reading and writing. They explicitly discuss the effect of the grammatical choices. Then pupils get opportunities to experiment with these techniques in their own writing, maybe scaffolded at first. And finally, they reflect, perhaps with peer or teacher feedback, on whether they successfully achieved their intended effect using that grammatical tool.
Making it interactive and even playful seems crucial too, to move away from the potentially dry nature of grammar exercises.
Essential for engagement and for deeper processing and understanding, this can involve all sorts of things. Games like Grammar Bingo focused on spotting features in texts. Scavenger hunts, where pupils look for examples of specific grammar points in books around the classroom. Role-playing scenarios where they have to use language in particular ways. An example, using different modal verbs to make a persuasive pitch or negotiate something. Using visual aids like sentence diagramming or color-coding different parts of sentences to see their structure can also help.
And sentence combining, you mentioned that earlier.
Yes, sentence combining activities are specifically highlighted as being strongly supported by research for developing sentence fluency. This is where pupils are given simple sentences or clauses and are explicitly taught and encouraged to combine them in different ways using the conjunctions, relative clauses, adverbials, or punctuation they are learning. It directly teaches them flexibility and control in sentence construction, helping them move beyond simple sentence patterns.
It sounds like giving them language building blocks and letting them play, getting a feel for the possibilities. And you mentioned metacognitive talk as well. Thinking about thinking.
Yes, this is really about making the often invisible thinking processes of writing, including grammatical decision-making, visible and explicit. Teachers can do this by thinking aloud during shared writing sessions.
How would that sound?
A teacher might say something like, okay, I've written this sentence here. The old wizard walked slowly. It's okay, but it feels a bit plain. I think I could add some extra detail about the wizard using a relative clause. Let's see, maybe. The old wizard, who had a long gray beard, walked slowly. Yes, I like that better. See how that relative clause adds a nice bit of description right into the sentence.
Yep.
And then, crucially, they encourage pupils to articulate their own choices when they write or revise. Asking questions like, why did you choose to use a dash here for your parenthesis instead of brackets? Or, what effect were you hoping to achieve by starting the sentence with an adverbial? It helps pupils internalize the idea that grammar isn't just rules to follow, it's a set of strategic choices writers make.
That makes total sense. It's not just about knowing the rule, it's about understanding why you might use it and when it's effective. And for tackling those common difficulties we discussed earlier, subject-verb agreement, comma splices, etc., are there specific remediation strategies suggested?
Yes, the sources suggest several targeted strategies for addressing common errors. Firstly, the importance of not trying to fix everything at once. Focus on teaching and providing feedback on one specific skill or error pattern at a time. Provide really targeted feedback on pupil writing instead of overwhelming them by marking every single error. Maybe highlight instances of just one specific error type, like comma splices, throughout a piece. Perhaps model the correction for one example, and then ask the pupil to try and find and fix the others themselves.
More manageable.
Much more manageable and more likely to lead to learning. Use those interactive activities we talked about for focused practice on particular tricky areas. Immediate correction and clear explanation during oral work, or quick whiteboard activities where everyone tries something and you can see misunderstandings straight away, can also be very effective for addressing misconceptions quickly.
And the source table you mentioned had some specific hands-on examples for tackling tricky concepts.
Yes, the table provided some really concrete ideas. For example, using word sorting activities to help pupils physically manipulate words and distinguish between categories like adverbs and adjectives based on their function. Using physical manipulatives like sentence strips or cut out words and phrases that pupils can physically move around to teach concepts like apostrophes for possession or to explore different ways of structuring a sentence. Explicitly teaching sentence combining, as we said, as a direct strategy to help pupils reduce comma splices and run-on sentences by giving them other options.
What about passive voice or subjunctive?
For the passive voice, reintroducing and practicing the by zombies test as a fun way to identify it. And for the subjunctive, perhaps using role-play scenarios involving if I were, wishes, or hypothetical situations, or engaging pupils in collaborative rulemaking activities where they look at examples of the subjunctive in formal texts and try to figure out together when and why it's used. These are all approaches designed to be more active, more contextual, and ultimately more memorable and effective than just reading a rule and filling in blanks on a worksheet.
So it sounds like even the most abstract concepts like the subjunctive can be taught in more practical, engaging, research-informed ways.
Exactly. The evidence strongly points towards these contextualized, functional, interactive, and metacognitive approaches as being far more effective for actually improving pupils' writing quality in the long run than relying solely on decontextualized drilling, whatever the pressures of the test might be.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize everything we've covered in this deep dive. We've seen the curriculum's quite ambitious vision for an integrated, holistic model for literacy in years 5 and 6. We've explored the specific and often quite complex linguistic skills pupils are expected to learn in spelling, punctuation, and grammar. We've looked at the structure and content of the statutory SpaG test at the end of year 6. And we spent quite a bit of time discussing that significant tension created by the test's format potentially conflicting with the research evidence on effective pedagogy.
That's a good summary. The test, through its format and high stakes, tends to incentivize isolated, decontextualized teaching. Yet, extensive research consistently shows that this approach has minimal positive impact on children's actual writing quality and might even be detrimental in some ways. However, the crucial takeaway from the sources isn't that grammar teaching itself is pointless or should be abandoned. Not at all. It's that how it's taught matters immensely. Isolated instruction focused on rules and labels appears largely ineffective for improving writing quality, while integrated approaches, embedded within authentic reading and writing tasks, show much more promise and are strongly supported by the available evidence.
So moving toward a coherent pedagogy based on this evidence would mean what exactly?
A coherent pedagogy, as outlined in the sources we reviewed, needs to fundamentally view grammar as a writer's toolbox. The primary focus has to be on understanding the function, the purpose, and the deliberate choices a writer makes for specific effects, using grammar strategically to control formality, achieve objectivity with the passive voice, convey degrees of possibility with modal verbs, add detail elegantly with relative clauses, and so on.
And the primacy of context is non-negotiable, it sounds like.
Absolutely essential. Learning must happen primarily within the context of authentic reading and writing experiences. Pupils need to analyze language being used meaningfully and apply their understanding in their own meaningful communication, not just through disconnected drills and exercises. And developing sentence-level fluency, particularly through research-backed activities like sentence combining, is highlighted as a really robust strategy. It directly improves pupils' ability to construct varied and complex sentences, which in turn frees up their cognitive resources, their brain power, for focusing on the higher-level demands of composition like ideas, structure, and audience awareness.
Okay, so putting all this evidence into practice on the ground, what are the key recommendations that emerge for teachers and maybe for school leaders who are trying to navigate this complex landscape?
For teachers, the key messages seem to be: try to embed your grammar instruction as short, focused mini lessons that arise naturally from and connect directly to your reading and writing units. Make consistent use of high-quality mentor texts, real books, real articles to show pupils how authors use grammar and punctuation effectively in context. Focus your teaching on the why, the function, the purpose, the effect of grammatical choices, not just on memorizing the definition or the label. Make practice active, interactive, and varied, moving beyond reliance on repetitive worksheets. And crucially, think about using assessment diagnostically. Use test results or your analysis of pupils' writing not just for grading, but to identify specific areas where individuals or groups need further help, and then teach and reteach those concepts in context, rather than just resorting to more isolated practice.
That makes sense. And for school leaders, they have the difficult job of managing school improvement and accountability pressures.
For school leaders, the recommendations focus on fostering a coherent, consistent approach to SpaG teaching across the whole school. This means ensuring accurate terminology is used consistently, but more importantly, promoting and supporting this contextualized, evidence-based pedagogy we've been discussing. Investing in high-quality professional development for teachers on how to effectively teach grammar through methods like using mentor texts and sentence combining is absolutely key. Teachers need the skills and confidence to do this well. Leaders should also prioritize investing in rich, diverse classroom libraries and text resources that can serve as powerful mentor examples, steering away from an over-reliance on potentially cheaper but less effective, commercially produced, decontextualized workbooks or schemes.
And protecting time.
And perhaps most critically, school leaders must protect and prioritize dedicated time within the curriculum for pupils to engage in actual extended pieces of authentic writing, drafting, revising, editing, the whole process. The ultimate goal, surely, is developing capable, confident writers who can communicate effectively for a range of purposes. And that requires significant time spent actually engaging in the messy, complex, but ultimately rewarding process of composition, not just preparing for or taking a test on grammatical labels.
That really brings it back to the core purpose, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The true measure of success should be the quality, the fluency, the effectiveness of a child's writing, not just their ability to circle the adverb or identify the passive voice in an isolated sentence.
The sources we looked at are very clear on where the real educational value lies, yes.
So we've taken quite a deep dive today into the complex, sometimes contentious, world of Year 5 and 6, spelling, punctuation, and grammar within the English curriculum. We have explored the ambitious, integrated vision the curriculum sets out. We've dug into the specific skills pupils are grappling with, including those tricky concepts like the passive voice and the subjunctive mood. We've examined the structure and the significant research-backed critiques of the statutory SpaG test. And crucially, we've highlighted the evidence-based ways that grammar instruction can actually empower children to become better, more confident, more effective writers.
That tension between the demands of the assessment system and the principles of effective pedagogy is undoubtedly a major challenge for schools and teachers working in this area. But the sources do provide a clear path forward, one that's rooted in teaching grammar in context, focusing on its function, using interactive methods, and ultimately valuing grammar as a powerful creative tool for the writer, not just a set of rules to be memorized for a test.
And that leads us to a final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to perhaps mull over, based directly on the research critique we explored today. If decades of robust educational evidence consistently show that teaching grammar in isolation, the very approach that the current high-stakes test seems to incentivize, has little to no positive impact on the actual quality of children's authentic narrative writing. What does that tell us about what we truly value, and perhaps how we measure success when it comes to developing writing skills in our primary education system?
It certainly prompts reflection on priorities and methods.
It absolutely does. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the English curriculum.